I'm currently in the WP Query Codex page. I'll provide a link to this in the resource section of this lecture. Here's what WordPress has to say about this class. WP Query is a class defined, and WP includes /query.php that deals with the intricacies of a post or page's request to a WordPress blog. The WP blog header.php gives the WP Query object information defining the current request. And then WP Query determines what type of query it's dealing with, possibly a category, archive, dated archive, feed, or search, and fetches the requested post. It retains a lot of the information on the request, which can be pulled at a later date. This class, which we will go over soon, is probably one of the most famous and most used classes by WordPress developers. It's used because it's so simple to get started with. It provides a lot of options and is documented quite heavily. This class lets you interact with the database by grabbing posts. It seems simple, but posts are very complex in their design. This class is meant to help you get past that complexity. You may have noticed that WordPress provides a plethora of functions for interacting with the database. We are allowed to write custom SQL queries, but that's only when we need complete control. At this point, we don't need to use custom queries, but I promise you, we will go over how to do that in a future lecture. For now, the functions and classes provided are tailored solutions to the most common problems we have. So, the WP Query class is the exact solution WordPress uses to query for posts that are loaded in our templates. You'll notice soon enough that the methods are similar to the functions we've used so far. Let me show you how this works. To get started with the WP Query class, you need to make a new instance of this class. I'm going to create a variable named RP Query, where RP is short for related post. I'm going to create a new instance of the WP Query class, and this class has one argument, which is completely optional. The argument is an array of keys and values that specify what kind of post we want. If you look at the documentation, you'll notice there are literally dozens of keys we can set. Each key already has a default value, so you do not need to feel pressure to define every single one. By default, WordPress will set its parameters to look for posts that have been published recently. For the most part, that's fine, but we would like to make a few adjustments to that. First, I want to shorten how many results are returned. By default, WordPress will use the setting in the reading settings page. In an earlier lecture, we set this to 4. However, I only want 2 results returned, so we have to set a key called posts per page. This value controls how many posts a query can return per page. By setting this value to 2, we assure ourselves only 2 posts will show up from this. Next, we want to make sure that the post we're currently viewing does not show up on this list of posts. In this case, we can set the post not in key. I'm not sure if you can see this clearly, but there are 2 underscores after the word post. It's very important your key matches mine. This key accepts an array of post IDs. So the question is, how do we get the ID for the current post? WordPress provides a global variable named post, which we can access directly inside the loop. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to learn more about this variable. Here's what WordPress has to say about it. Contains data from the current post in the loop. This variable is an object that contains properties about the current post. One of these values is the ID. It's pretty simple to use. You just pass in the post variable and grab the property ID like so. The post variable is always available to us in the loop. The very last thing we need to do is make sure that the posts displayed are similar to the ones the user is reading. There are dozens of ways to go about this, but let's keep it real simple. I'm going to assume that posts in the same category should be similar. So, let's make it so that the posts that appear are in the same category as the one the user is currently reading. First, we need to grab the categories assigned to this post. Create a variable named categories and set its value returned by the function getTheCategory. Despite its name, this function will return multiple categories in array form. If you're unsure about what values a function returns, then it's always good practice to actually just print out the data so you can view what's in it. I'm going to use the printr function, which is a PHP function that will output array and object data. Refresh the page, and you will see the object being outputted like so. Now we have a good idea about what kind of data is returned. I'm going to remove this print statement and move on to the query object. To choose a specific category, we have to define the cat key. This key's value will only be an integer, which represents the ID of the category. Even though we may have multiple categories, I'm going to concern myself with the very first category in the array. WordPress will always assign a category to a post, even if the user forgets to assign one, so it's safe to assume there will always be at least one category in the array. Grabbing the first category in the array, we next need to grab the ID of that category. That ID is assigned under the property termID. That's it. Let me quickly go over what's going on. To query the database for posts, we create a new instance of the WP query object. By passing in this array, we can specify what kind of post we'd like to grab. The post per page allows us to define how many posts we'd like per page. The post not in allows us to define what post should not be returned. In our case, the current post being viewed should not be returned. The cat allows us to define if the post should be in a specific category. By doing all this, WordPress will then generate a custom SQL query and then execute that query and return an array of posts. All we have to do is now display the results. We actually already know how to do this. Inside a conditional statement, we can call a method from the RP query object, which is halfPosts. You'll notice that this method is the exact same method used in our main loop. What we have here is called a secondary loop. I promise you that I will explain what this is in just a moment. For now, just keep following along. If this custom query does have posts, then we can use a while loop like so. Then we can grab the current post using the post method. And just like last time, I'm going to grab the static HTML and just replace it with its template tag equivalents. You don't have to use the RP query variable anymore, as WordPress assumes all post data comes from it. For example, if I used the title function, WordPress will grab the title from whatever the current loop it's in. Since it's inside our custom loop, it'll grab the title from the custom loop. It will not grab the title from the main loop that encompasses everything. I hope that makes sense. If not, I'll actually go more into detail in just a moment. For now, I encourage you to pause the video and try it yourself. Alright, if you weren't able to get it, that's fine. Let's go over it together. First, we have to grab the featured image of this post. Inside a conditional statement, we can use hasPostThumbnail function. Then, we can replace these values with the appropriate template tags. For the thumbnail, I'm going to set the size to thumbnail. Unlike last time, we don't need the full size image. By default, the thumbnail size is 150 by 150, which is good enough. This isn't anything new so far. Continuing on, we use the functions, the permalink, the title, get the date, comments number, and the excerpt. This is really simple so far. The very last thing we need to do is reset everything. Earlier I talked about main and secondary loops. In the resource section, I provide a link to the function WP reset post data. It's very important what WordPress has to say here. Use this function to restore the global post variable of the main query loop after a secondary loop using the new WP query class. It restores the post variable to the current post in the main query. Differences between the main query loop and secondary query loops are: the main loop is based on the URL request and is processed before templates are loaded. Secondary loops are queries using the new WP query class in theme template files or plugin files. As I stated in an earlier lecture, WordPress will scan the URL and determine how many and what posts to display for the page. WordPress will automatically generate a query using the WP query class. This is what's called the main loop. Every page you visit has one. The WordPress team understands that sometimes you'll want to make your own loop and queries. You can also use this class to generate your own. These custom loops are called secondary query loops. With this in mind, we run into one huge problem, and that is, how does WordPress know when you're finished running your secondary loop? You do that by calling this function right after your secondary loop. If anything, this is the most important part when creating secondary loops. By not calling this function, you will confuse WordPress. What will end up happening is that the data inside the loop will become unpredictable, so make sure you call this function. That is the last step. Refresh the page, and you should now see a related post being displayed. So far, this has been the most complex task we've done. But it's very important that you understand what's going on. This will not be the last time we'll use the WP query class. The WP query class is one of the most used classes provided by WordPress. Before I end this lecture, let's take a look at some of the cases where using the WP query class is beneficial over other available functions. To add a list of related posts under the current post. For example, a list of all posts in the same category. To create two loops on the same page. For example, an FAQ page with the question titles at the top and the content beneath. To create a custom list of recent posts in the sidebar or footer of your site when the recent post widget doesn't do what you need or you'd rather code it yourself. To create custom queries for taxonomies using more than one taxonomy to define what's displayed. To query post types which aren't outputted by the default query, such as attachments. There are some common scenarios where the WP query class can be used. Now let's take a look at some situations where it wouldn't be appropriate to use the WP query class. If all you want to do is change the way posts are displayed for a particular content type or archive, don't use the WP query class. Instead, simply create a template file for that archive or content type and modify the loop in that template file. If you want to display more or less posts than would normally be shown on an archive page, don't use WP query to create a whole new query. Instead, use pre-get-post to modify the main query along with a conditional tag to single out where exactly you want to do it. Beware of running too many queries on the page. You could theoretically create a page with hundreds of custom queries, but just think of the server load. If you need more than 4 or 5 queries on a page, you might want to consider creating extra pages.